Assalamu alaikum, my dear viewers of Hussein 3 TV. Welcome to the second and final episode of the series on ISIS. As always, I'm your host, Ali Jassim. In the previous episode, we defined the terrorist organization ISIS and discussed where it originated and how it became so powerful in such a short period of time, as well as how it associates itself to the notion of caliphate. Stay tuned, dear viewers, as we talk more in depth about this enemy of Islam, and we will answer questions like, why is ISIS targeting Shia and demolishing their shrines? What are the similarities and differences of ISIS anti-Shi'ism ideology with those of other groups, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan? And are there really naive people around the world that actually believe they are conveying the true image of Islam? We will answer these questions and many more with our dear guest, Dr. Hassan Abbas, an academic and professor at Washington, D.C. University. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hassan Abbas.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to have another good conversation with you.
Dr. Abbas, let's start with the first question here. Whom is ISIS actually targeting? Who is their enemy? We see them continuously targeting people from all faiths and in various countries.
That is true. Anyone who's trying to stop them, anyone who they can scare so that they can build their new model, I mean, that's their strategy at this time. Partly based on creating fear, partly trying to push back all those who can challenge them. But I think there are certain trends which we can see in their targeting. Because they are operating primarily in Syria and in Iraq, that's where their militaries are operating, that's where they are inviting everyone from outside to come in, that's where they are trying to create their new space or new state. So in those areas, they are, from their point of view, they're trying to clean those areas. And in those areas, we know that they started off with Yazdis, Christians, but it seems that the Shia Muslims are their target number one. Within the Muslim world. So Shias number one, then Yazdis, then Christians, there are Christian Arabs. Unfortunately, no Jews are left because Jews have been historically thrown out of those areas. Jews were also part and parcel of these civilizations. Even now that you go, Jews are in Iran, in Iraq, and other places, but they have been thrown out in the previous such actions. But today, I think the Shia Muslims are their prime target. But at the same time, they are trying to operate in various European countries as well. We have seen attacks in Paris, which were very choreographed, very organized, in Brussels, now in Germany. And these attacks are also coordinated or at least inspired by the idea of by the idea of ISIS. And that tells me that anyone who can start a campaign against them will be targeted by them. Attacks in Turkey, for example, are another important thing. Many ISIS fighters believed that Turkey indirectly was helping them because, for instance, many of these fighters first went to Turkey, and from their Turkey they went to Syria, and that's how they operated. But then when Turkey realized that this is what is happening, Turkey tried to stop this, and the reaction was suicide bombings in Istanbul, in Ankara. Many of the attacks, because they thought, oh, we have to now scare Turkey as well. So whosoever will try to stop them will come in their way. But at the core of this, it seems to me that the Muslim minority groups, even within the Sunni groups, just see their pattern. The first attacks were targeting holy shrines of prophets, of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was their strategy. So even within the Sunnis, who were against them have been killed and targeted, including with Sufis and then the Shia and others.
Yes, thank you for that. Now, we never hear a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist, or a Hindu blowing themselves up anywhere in the world. Why is it always Sunni extremists?
I would argue that yes, there have been in previous cases, for example, Hindu Hindus who were involved and Buddhists involved in the Sri Lankan conflict. In Sri Lanka, there was this ethnic group. There are a couple of very important Western research publications which explain. For instance, there is a famous book called Dying to Kill, which explains by a very famous American professor in the University of Chicago, who did a study and explained that terrorist activity, especially the suicide bombing, was happening in various countries where there was outside occupation. So if there were outside forces taking control of your area, a reaction to them came in the form of suicide bombing. So there's that one way to look at it as well. In other cases, extremism, militancy, killing people in the name of religion has been, if not common, it has existed among Christians, Jews, and other groups as well. Look what in case of Burma or Myanmar, what the Buddhists are doing. Some of the monks there, or who have been associated with always peace, love, and harmony, have been involved in killing Muslims in that part of the world. So this exists in various parts of the world. Within the Muslim world also, there were different sects who have been involved in different forms of extremism. So I am a little reluctant to call it Sunni extremism, because Sunnis are, let's say, 65 or 70% of the Muslim world, and I cannot, we cannot as Muslims blame one sect completely, because that will not be true. Yes, most of the extremists are coming, in case of Afghanistan, in case of Syria and in Iraq, coming from the backgrounds which are Sunni. But those people who currently are spearheading ISIS, I don't think they're Sunni Muslims. They are terrorists, and I don't even consider them Muslims. They are the takfiris who themselves, I think, are outside the pale of Islam, and they have nothing to do with religion. So that's why I'm a little careful with this idea. Yes, a lot of this extremism is happening in the Muslim world, in some cases with the Shia Muslims as well, and some kind of radical approach or conservative approach. But it is always happening in those countries where the governance systems are not equitable, where people's representative are not the ones who are ruling them, where authoritarianism, dictatorships, monarchies exist. In those countries, there are very few opportunities for ordinary people to express their ideas. When you stop them from expressing their ideas in a pluralist, open-minded fashion, then they adopt ways which lead them to violence. And then suicide bombing is the ultimate thing. And I think there's also a huge failure within the Islamic education institutions across the Muslim world, where the emphasis on jihad, in the sense of jihad, when I use the word, as you and I know, and I'm sure your audience know, the primary form of ijtihad, primary form of jihad is linked to partly ijtihad, but also it is linked to a peaceful manner to cleanse yourself. It is to elevate yourself spiritually, to work against your own sinful inclinations. That's the best form of jihad, as told to us by the Prophet of Islam and his great companions and his family. That is the real message. Today, the word jihad is all linked to extremist ideas, because in many cases, the clerics who believed in takfiri view, who believe in Salafist view, they are the ones who are projecting Islam in a different fashion. They are to be blamed. I think those clerics and those political fake scholars who project extremism as a mainstream idea, they are to be blamed, and I don't consider them to be part of the mainstream Muslim tradition, where Sunni, Shia, or even among other sects of Islam.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Now, are there really naive people around the world that actually believe they are conveying the true image of Islam, the religion that is based on peace, love, and respect for all?
Unfortunately, there are many such naive and ignorant people, because of 2 or 3 reasons. One, because in the modern sense, the Muslim world is going through a transition. They find themselves into a new world order after the World War II, where the new state system, which I think is a very good way to govern. Muslims are used to their old myths about empires and about the larger Muslim ummah. and they are not facing the reality, because unfortunately there is no one Muslim ummah. There are different states, so people emphasize their identity as Turkish, as Turks, or as Persians, or as Arabs, or as Pakistani or Indian or Indonesian and Malaysians. So those divisions, those ethnic identities create a certain distance, which they should be seen in terms of ethnic diversity, political diversity. People, and the greatest book ever, Quran al-Hakim, says very clearly that God has created these differences so that you can be identified. So, but Muslims have taken this argument to a different level. So there are those political, ethnic divisions, and that is one thing to be to understand. For the Western world, they see, or Western world, I should not say in one big general term, many people in the world, in the West as well as in East, or China, Russia, they see different problems in those different Muslim countries, which their ethnic issues, their political issues, their economic issues. They see Muslims overall in countries where either there's more conflict or more violence, or there are dictatorships. So for the outsider, when they look at the Muslim world, they find them all divided. They find them all, in many cases, going through conflict and violence. And then they see, oh, these Muslims are backward people. This is how they behave. Because these people, naive people or ignorant people, have no understanding of the rich Muslim history. They are told about Quran al-Hakim as a book which talks only about violence. They have not opened the book because they have not probably opened their own religious books of Torah or Bible. Because if anyone who reads Torah or Bible, they will understand the Quranic narration or the narrative or the tone in Quran very, very useful and very, very familiar, because the diction, because the style of messaging is very, very comparable and very, very similar. So that is the tragedy: ignorance, lack of understanding, lack of interreligious or religious harmony, or lack of interaction between different faiths. That is the current problem that the world faces. I would love to see great religious figures, like whether it is a pope in Rome, or it is the great rabbi in Jerusalem, to be visiting Mecca, Medina, to be visiting Karbala, Najaf, and people from Mecca, Medina, Karbala, and Najaf and Mashhad visiting all the great religious traditions and religious places around the world. That interaction is missing, for which ordinary people, they see their own religious clerics and they see religious leaders of other religions, all very different from each other, not talking to each other, not even aware of each other, and that creates these different pockets. So even if we are connected through internet, through web, through media, we are all very disconnected when it comes to religious traditions and religious values.
We understand that ISIS is bombing countries in which they have strongholds in to gain more land and expand their state. Now, what's the reason behind their attacks in other countries that are very far from their headquarters, like Belgium or Egypt?
I think in some countries, or in case of these attacks in Brussels and other places that you've mentioned, they may not be looking to expand their own space, but they are only in a position where they inspire such things. So maybe there are some young people in these countries who now understand that, okay, now there are more border controls, the international organizations are watching us, the security agencies will look at us, they will ask us at the airport, okay, you are a Syrian immigrant, or your parents had come from some Muslim country, now you are going to Syria, a country where all crisis is happening, there's violence, there's war, there's conflict. Why you want to go there? So people are being watched and stopped from going to Syria and Iraq. So when they are stuck in their own countries, they are so disconnected from the societies where they're living in. They have not assimilated well. They have not developed a value for the societies where they are living. But they are now inspired by the ISIS worldview. They conduct terrorist attacks in those countries. ISIS leadership may not necessarily be asking them to do that, but this explains that many young Muslims in various European or non-Muslim states are feeling disconnected or isolated. Maybe there are economic opportunity, missing of economic opportunities, maybe they're getting bad advice from their religious clerics or mosques. All of these factors are at play. But this is more to me a sign of ISIS inspiration, rather direct ISIS control or management of this. But at another level, ISIS would like these attacks to happen. They immediately jump and take credit for these, and maybe through their projection, through their messaging, they want to inspire, because they know that if their space is being restricted, and we know in Iraq, ISIS is being pushed back. Even in Syria, ISIS is being pushed back. They are under pressure. So they want to create that impression that even if you'll push us, even if you'll take our territory, we are going to continue to create terror. So all of these factors are at play.
Now, ISIS has been demolishing shrines, cultural heritage, and Shia pilgrims in Iraq. Just a few weeks back, they sent a few suicide bombers to the shrine of Sayyid Muhammad ibn Imam Ali al-Hadi in Balad district. On the first day of Ramadan a couple of months back, they claimed responsibility of a car bomb in holy city of Karbala. How do you explain such hatred and hostility towards the Shia?
Correct, exactly. I think, as I had mentioned previously, the theological foundations of ISIS are linked to this very narrow-minded, Kharijite, extremist, takfiri worldview. So the Shias, unfortunately, are their prime target, because they view Shias to be the ones who are trained, who are educated to stand against oppression, to stand against this kind of violence. And the Shia Muslims, along with many Sufi Muslims and Sunni Muslims, have been standing up to this kind of oppression for the last 1400 years. In many instances, in many contexts, in many different theaters. So, because in Iraq, Shia Muslims are in majority. And that was something which was very difficult for those Muslims who had worked under the Ba'athist control. There were certain tribes which had greatly benefited from Saddam Hussein era. For them, there is that old hatred as well, because their power has been taken away. So for them, the Shia are a target not necessarily because of theological reasons, but also because of political reasons, because Shias are now in power and they cannot just adjust to this new reality where the Shia Muslims are stronger in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Bahrain. There have been the rise of the Shia, if I may call that. I'm not saying it to explain it in a sectarian fashion. I am using this word, the Shia Muslims, in a political context. So this rise of the Shia has also been a very problematic issue for extremist Sunnis. An ordinary Sunni, a Sufi, will have no problem, because Shias at the end of the day are maybe 20-25% in the Arab world. In the heartland of the Arab world, maybe they are 40%, even my argument, because if you count the Shia Muslims in Iraq, in Iran, 25% or 20% in Saudi Arabia, 35% in Kuwait, 70 to 80% in Bahrain, 20-25% among the Muslims in India, and 25% in Pakistan. The Shias are a very strong group in terms of their population. In terms, they are 25 to maybe 30%. Or in the heartland, as I had said, in the hardcore, the Arab heartland, they may be 40%. So for the extremist Sunnis who only look at these issues from their sectarian point of view, this is a shocking reality. This is a total shock for them, because their tribes in those areas are no more powerful. So that's what we see. And I was talking to a senior official from the region who was telling me that it is not that difficult to defeat ISIS in a military fashion. But he said that will not resolve the problem, because there are some tribes who, because of tribal affiliation, are supporting ISIS in Iraq. And that's why we have to cut them off politically. But the major issue is, for them, it is that tribal affiliation and power. So that has to be kept in mind. If the attacks are happening on Shias in Iraq, it is not necessarily only for sectarian reasons. It is also for political reasons, because these are the ones who have been thrown out of power, and they are using violence to recreate the Saddam Hussein era. And so that factor I thought I will mention, because that is also important to be discussed.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hassan Abbas. Now, why are they still teaching the Wahhabi school, which supports and calls for beheadings and suicide bombings of Shias at particular madrasas in some Gulf countries? Why isn't the world doing anything to shut them down, these madrasas that brainwash countless people, turning them into so-called jihadists?
I think there are various political, economic, and religious reasons why some of these hubs of or sanctuaries of terrorists are not being hit. I will even mention the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region, where extremists are very strong, and ISIS is trying to expand into those areas as well. Within the Arab world, we know of many extremist clerics who are actually very popular through Twitter and Facebook as well, but they are not being challenged, because the problem is, when an extremist narrative becomes mainstream or becomes popular, if you'll close one door of them, if you'll cut them out from Facebook, they'll go to Twitter. Twitter, they'll go to YouTube. So something more has to be done. They have to be challenged. And the narrative within the Muslim world, unfortunately, has become so sectarian that, for example, if a top Shia scholar, who may be the best scholar of Islam in the world, if he or she maybe will challenge ISIS, those who are siding with ISIS will say, oh, this is a Shia who is saying it. Same goes in the other direction. So the narrative and the debate and discussion within the Muslim world has become a little narrow. So only in case of ISIS, we need more Sunni scholars who have to stand up and challenge ISIS. And that is happening. Even in one of my recent trips to Iraq, I met Sunni scholars in Karbala who were telling me that how they are trying their best to counter the narrative of ISIS, because that's not a representative of Sunni Islam, and they were absolutely right. I think even Saudi Arabia, there is that realization. So it is happening now, but those extremist clerics, I don't call them even clerics or religious scholars, because they have grown beards and they wear colorful turbans on their heads, but they know nothing of Islam. They have their own political economy, they have their own interests, and they have established huge networks of religions, of television stations, of media and networking, and that's how they recruit people to their extremist worldview. They may not be calling or using the banner of ISIS, but their messaging is very negative. That has to be checked within Islam, and that will happen when there is more religious harmony, when there is more education, and when the regimes become more open to ideas and more open to a pluralist way of thinking. So unless that happens, we cannot expect somebody from outside to come in the Muslim world and do a surgical, in a surgical manner, clean the Muslim society of extremists. The Muslim society from within will have to come to terms with this reality of extremism and challenge it in a step-by-step, peaceful, soft manner. And that's the only way forward in my view.
Dr. Abbas, what are the similarities and differences of ISIS anti-Shi'ism ideology with those of other groups, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan?
In Pakistan and Afghanistan, as we have seen, that the Al-Qaeda narrative, which was extremist narrative, which was challenging the very idea of Pakistan, which was challenging the idea of a pluralist society in Afghanistan. I mean, these extremist groups had their own limited local agenda, but they got transformed by Al-Qaeda and then by ISIS ideology, because that was the only space through which they could have become dominant and powerful. In case of Afghanistan, Taliban, for instance, Taliban predominantly comes, unfortunately, from one ethnic group, Pashtuns, and I have lived among them. I have worked in those areas as well. Pashtuns have a very strong, very rich tradition in cultural sense, in political sense, but then these extremists who belong to a subsect of Sunni group, Deobandi, which is not strong historically, which is a madrasa in India today called in a city called Deoband. This is like 200 to 300 years old. They are the ones who came up with a very dogmatic, narrow-minded view of religion, and they played a very important role. That's from where Taliban draw their inspiration. That's from Pakistani Taliban draw their inspiration, and they are also extremist, but they are against every other group. There are various other Sunni groups. For example, there is another Sunni subsect called a Barelvi group. That's also linked to a small town in India, in a city of Barel, where a big Sunni madrasa was created. So there is this clash between Deobandi and Barelvi Sunni school of thought in India. The Barelvi groups are very close to the Shia worldview in terms of Sufis or awliya and going to these shrines. If you go to India and Pakistan today, in every other town you'll find some shrine, some grave, which is people revere that, and you'll find almost all of the Sufis shrines and their teachings of those Sufis to be very close to the message of Ahlul Bayt. You'll find every major Sufi in South Asia to be a great lover of Imam Ali. And that is that tradition. So Deobandi tradition, which feeds into the Taliban worldview, is anti-Sufi and anti-Shrine and anti-Shia. So I'm sorry I went into detail, but for the audience to understand that in South Asia there are these old traditions, old groups, which have an, in a sense, pro-Sufi and pro-Shia worldview, and others who are anti-Shia. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS tried to benefit from this, and ISIS tried to recruit from people who belong to this anti-Sufi and anti-Shia grouping. So that is being played. ISIS has been able to conduct terrorist attacks in Kabul. We know there was a major terrorist attack recently against Hazara, who are mostly Shia. This is an ethnic group. They have these Chinese-like features. In Afghanistan, there are Hazara community in Pakistan as well. Because they are very obvious from their features, you see their faces and they are somewhat East Asian or somewhat Chinese features, they are immediately recognizable. So they have been killed because if there are there are people with those features in a bus, it is easy for the Deobandis or the Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists to see and immediately know, okay, these are Shias. So they target them directly. So this, unfortunately, the Al-Qaeda ISIS worldview has had its impact and influence in South Asia as well, mostly in Afghanistan, but in many, many parts of Pakistan. And in the last 10 years or so, we have seen increasing terrorist attacks targeting some of the Shia professionals. For example, the Shia doctors in Karachi were targeted step by step. I've heard various figures, but some people mentioned there are between 200 to 300 doctors who were doing very important charity work, who were doing great work in society. They were targeted by Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Karachi because that was the way to create a fear among the Shia Muslims and create a disconnect between Shia professionals and those who are doing a philanthropy work, creating their disconnect from the society in which they were operating. So that has to be kept in mind for various extremists. They go and target the Shia Muslims and try to benefit from old local groups which have been doing different kinds of these conservative extremist work for the last many hundred years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan Abbas. Now, this next question, I'm pretty sure, is on the minds of most people around the world. Why is ISIS still alive? Why is it still carrying out its violence? Why hasn't the world done anything to stop them? I'm pretty sure if the world, which has a population of about 7 billion, was serious in eradicating a group of only about 100,000, it would be like a walk in the park. What would you like to say about that?
To explain the answer that I have to give you, I'll give you another example. I mean, with the same passion and the same argument, I can ask a question, why the world has not done enough to deal with poverty. Go to Africa. There are people who are dying of hunger every day. There are small children, infants, who are dying in hundreds and thousands on daily or weekly basis because they have nothing to eat. And I can argue in the Western world, in many of the rich countries, in the Middle East and other places, 40 to 50% of the food is destroyed because either it is not looking very fancy, or because we have a lot of food, we eat a little and throw the rest of the food. And one would argue it is common sense to use that extra food in developing countries. It can feed all of the people in Africa or in other countries which are poor, but that's not happening. The people who think they have a lot don't care where the impoverished and the poor are dying of basic need for water and food. So I'm giving an example because, and there are a variety of reasons for why this is happening. This disconnect, if I may use a former Soviet Union or communist terminology, haves and have-nots, this inequality. Today, world is a classic example of, in a sense, of inequality, injustice. It is will be a long answer, or I have to maybe look at various economic, political factors to understand why some of the obvious injustices are not being stopped. So in comparison to that is, of course, a group like ISIS, which is a criminal group, as I had mentioned. They do smuggling, they do kidnapping, they do other terrible things. Then, of course, they do extremism and militancy in the name of religion. They behead people, they conduct suicide bombings, they destroy people's lives. And there is not enough effort to stop them, because in one case, for instance, we are only emphasizing need of military use. We think that we can bomb, and when bombings happen, some innocent people also die. The children of those innocent people then think of taking revenge. I think in the modern world, especially in the Middle East and those countries where ISIS is strong, in my view, in my reading and my research, ineffective, poorly equipped police forces is one reason why we are failing to deal with ISIS. If we have strong police and justice system, because policing is not works in the air. Policing means you have police officers who are properly fed, they have resources, they are good or well trained, they are wearing uniforms, they have the right kind of equipment, they have the training, they arrest somebody, then they have lawyers, they have proper prisons, then they go and take the person to a court of law where a judge is sitting who's well acquainted with the law, who's honest, who's neutral. And there's this process of rule of law. If those rule of law processes which are built on policing, which is built on good training, which is built on good judges, if there's emphasis on that kind of things, then if a person who's a potential recruit for ISIS in terms of his hatred, in terms of his extremist views, in terms of his violent behavior, in terms of his criminal background, then the local law enforcement can really pinpoint, arrest the person, deal with him. But if just a military officer is standing there and he's told such and such person is an ISIS guy, without any investigation, he takes out his weapon, kills that person, then the other people from the other side will continue to use violence. We have not been able to deal with ISIS because police forces, law enforcement, judiciary in Middle East is weak. Also, I will not be reluctant to mention that the European countries or the Western countries who are coalition partners or who are investing in many of these developing countries, they have to focus more on helping with judiciary and rule of law and policing. Often they are immediately jumped to selling these big ticket items which we call weaponry, fighter aircrafts, tanks. We don't need tanks and fighter aircraft to defeat ISIS, in my view. We need good education systems, we need rule of law, we need good police and good judges. And that is a longer process. You have to train them, you have to create good academies. So if I have to invest, I will today invest in police institutions, in judicial institutions. I would invest more in judges and teachers rather than necessarily in soldiers. That's one approach which will help us defeat not only ISIS, but whatever extremist group will come after ISIS.
Great. Now for the last question, we can consider ISIS as the upgraded version of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. What do you think will come after ISIS? Will there be a stronger, more violent terrorist group in the future?
That's a great question, and in terms of the future projections and the future prospects, if we go by the trend that we are seeing, which is linked to the worldview of Taliban, then to Al-Qaeda, then to ISIS, it seems we are going in a more problematic direction. And if the causes behind these terrorist organizations continue to operate, then we'll continue to see more problem. For example, this, as I mentioned, poor education systems, poor governance. We are not giving hope, energy, and the prospects of prosperity to the younger generation in the broader Muslim world. If that will continue to be the case, if authoritarian regimes which just don't want to hear any dissent, if those authoritarian regimes continue to operate, if power remains in the hands of elite, which is only active and powerful because they stay in one family, like in monarchies, if that continues to be the case, and if in combination to this authoritarianism and these monarchies, you will see fewer or lesser investment in education and in development, creating more frustration, then the reaction which we are seeing in the shape of Talibanization or Al-Qaeda worldview and ISIS, it will go to the next level. However, there's another way to look at it as well. I think that these three, and there are many other extremist and terrorist organizations within the Muslim world, like in Pakistan, there are groups such called Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. They are named, for example, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. There are groups, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. There's groups, also conservative groups like Hizbul Tahrir, and there are other groups as well. These groups have exposed also that the narrative of extremists is very, very shallow. It is not creating any hope because violence cannot resolve anything. So there is now better, my argument is, there is more realization within the Muslim world broadly that these people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban, they have hijacked the religion of Islam. They have hijacked the beautiful message of Islam. So there might be a counter-reaction or counter-revolution brewing up within the Muslim world also, which will challenge this. So there's also, my hope is that when the next group will come, which will certainly come, which may come in a different part of the world. Once that group comes up, the Muslims are also becoming more aware and more ready to face this kind of terrorism and extremism. But last but not the least, I would like to see Muslims getting more interaction among themselves, and the Muslim countries coming to some basic consensus, whether it is I would like to see lesser of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I would like to see better relations between Pakistan and India. We would like to see lesser of tension between Turkey and Egypt. We have created these different tension nodes which are keeping the whole anti-ISIS effort disconnected. Yeah. This can change when Muslim states will talk to each other more, when Muslims all across these countries, from the Persians to the Arabs to the Asians to the Muslims in the Western world, there is a strong, vibrant Muslim community in United States. There are strong Muslim communities in Europe who have a lot to bring to the Muslim world. More connectivity and more interaction between them, I think, will play a critical role, because I believe that yes, the extremists have hijacked Islam in some ways, but the noble message brought by the Prophet and brought by the great Islamic scholars and brought by the Ahlul Bayt is also better than all of this. That there is a certain strength and charisma and influence that message has, which is far more stronger than the idea of ISIS. And if the sacrifice of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala is understood, and if the message of Hazrat Ali alayhi salam in Nahjul Balagha is seen, and if the message of the great scholars of Islam over the historical context are seen, that has a strong anti-ISIS model. If you are aware of the message of the Prophet of Islam, then that message has such strength that hundreds of ISIS cannot do any damage to the great message of Islam. That's my hope, and that's, I think, what ultimately the Muslim, this cycle of violence will ultimately come to a point where those forces in Islam who believe in justice, who believe in equality, who believe in peaceful harmony and peaceful adjustment, or who believe in reconciliation, will ultimately be dominant.
Thank you. We have reached the end of the second and final episode of the series on ISIS. We thank you, dear brothers and sisters, and we thank our dear guest once again, Dr. Hassan Abbas. We hope to see you next time here on Current Events. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.